All right, so what's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is August 8th, 2024. The time is 2:53 p.m. where I'm at right now. I have a few hours in between my English classes to hop in here and start my new series, Book React 3. And this is the first book that I'm reading in the series that was a fan request. So if anybody out there has a book that you want me to read, that you want me to react to, and if you want to hook up on books yourself, hit me up, put it in the comments. In fact, I'm going to put this in the chat right now. What book should I react to next? Let me know which book I should holla at, which book I should run through, skim through, chop up with y'all, and yeah, let's do that. Let's make this actually an actual recurring series. I'm trying to do at least 10 books before the end of this year in the series. The first one I did was Cyber Racism by Jesse Daniels, which was a phenomenal sociological book. The second one I did was the book by Murat Ergin, a Turkish sociologist, titled Is the Turk a White Man? A phenomenal book as well, though I did have some issues with it. And this one is a book that I'm not that familiar with. It was not on my reading list, but it was a suggestion by my favorite person in the world, my wife, Akti. She said, "Hey, Simon, why don't you read this book?" So, I'm diving into it. I don't know much about it, don't know much what it's going to tell us, but I'm going to react to it. And that's the point of this series. We read the text, go in depth with the text, analyze the text, have the text challenge us. We challenge the text as well, and hopefully we reach some level of truth. We're going to do something here that the white supremacists don't do, the MAGA Republicans don't do, most Democrats don't do, most Americans don't do, and that's actually read a book from beginning to end. Not just look at TikTok videos, not just watch documentaries, not just scan through articles. We're going to actually read a book, something that a lot of y'all don't do, and I encourage more people to read. Now, before we get into this, let's break down what this book is. It's titled Hood. It's a part of the series called Object Lessons, and it was written by Allison Kinney. You can find this book on paperback on Amazon for the humble price of only $12. $12. And the Kindle version is actually more expensive. That doesn't make sense. Anyway, one of the stupidest comments that I got in my book react series was obviously from a conservative person. It was obviously from a person who doesn't like to read. And this person said, I didn't know about the author, so I didn't want to listen to the series. Let's think about how dumb that is. Number one, at the very beginning of all of my series, when I read these books, I always do backgrounds on the author, which we will find out about. Here's Allison Kinney right here. In every one of my book react series, I will always provide as much information as I can find online about the author. Most authors are not famous. They are not your Taylor Swifts and Drakes of the world. These people are actually in the libraries, in their study halls, behind the computers, typing away, researching, and writing. Of course, they're not going to be somebody you know. But if you're going to say you're not going to pay attention because it's from somebody you don't know, even if this person has a PhD and years of study behind them, that says more about you than does actually about me or the author. Anyway, Murat Ergin, the person who wrote Is the Turk a White Man, is a very accomplished sociologist and professor and writer and author with a very long resume. This woman right here, Allison Kinney, we're going to find out about her. So anybody that comes in here and says, I don't want to listen to the book react series because number one, I get all my information from TikTok and Instagram, and secondly, I don't know who the author is. Jump off a bridge. Anyway, here is Allison Kinney right here. She is an author, teacher, and nonfiction writer on culture, history, music, and social justice. Allison's second book, Avidly Reads Opera, was published by NYU Press in 2021. When making a solo trip to the opera, most everyone who wasn't raised on the art faces this question. Do I really belong here? Allison Kinney says yes and invites you to ride along with her to performances at Wagner's theater and also less conventionally at a prison. She's insightful and entertaining, but not merely good company. Her large conversation with the tradition regarding its pleasures and its problems should excite anyone eager to see opera with new eyes, said Seth Coulter Walls, the New York Times contributing music critic. Allison's first book of cultural history, Hood, which is what we will be reading today, was published by Bloomsbury Object Lesson Series in 2016. She's written online and or print in print for the New Yorker, pardon, the Paris Review Daily, La Femme's Quarterly, Long Reads, the New York Times, the Guardian, the Atlantic, Harper's Magazine, LA Review of Books and Avidly, Van Magazine, Gay Magazine, The Believer, New Republic, The New Inquiry, Hyperallergic, LitHub, and other publications. 5 of her essays have been named to notable essays in the Best American Essays from 2016 through 2020. Allison has taught nonfiction writing at the New School and at Catapult and is now assistant professor of writing at Eugene Lang College at the New School. She earned a New School MFA in creative writing fiction, then headed in a completely different direction. Here's more of her information here. By the way, the link to this is her website right here. You can watch all of her interviews and read more about her here. Here is her profile at the New School, which is a very famous school in New York City. Here's her information if you want to contact her. And yeah, here is her profile once again for anybody that wants to say, I don't want to listen to the book react series because I don't know who the author is. You will always know who the author is, you dumb person. Continuing here, Allison Kinney is the author of 2 nonfiction books, avidly reads opera and Hood. Her essays and articles have appeared online and or print at the New Yorker, etc., etc. We read that before. Allison teaches creative nonfiction writing, reading for writers, and writing electives. The degree she holds, the MFA in creative writing, the New School. A lot of people that come into my comment section and say the stupidest shit don't even have a degree at all. This woman has a master's in writing. Has a master's in writing. But to the uneducated out there, having degrees, having education is not important, right? Because we don't believe anything the media tells us, bruh. We don't read books, bruh. Anyway, here's once again all of her information. You can find the links to all of these right here. And let's jump into the book. Let's not waste any time. So here is the book Hood that we will be reading today. We'll only probably be reading the introduction in chapter 1. We'll probably do just a chapter a day. It's a very short book, about 175 pages. I'm looking forward to get into it. I don't know much about it, but let's read it page by page. Let's peel this back layer by layer. So the Object Lesson series achieves something very close to magic. The books take ordinary and even banal objects and animate them with a rich history of invention, political struggle, science, and popular mythology. Filled with fascinating details and conveyed in sharp, accessible prose, the books made the everyday world come to life. Be warned, once you've read a few of these, you'll start walking around your house, picking up random objects and musing aloud. I wonder what the story is behind this thing, said Stephen Johnson, author of Where Good Ideas Come From and How We Got to Now. In 1957, the French critic and semiotician Roland Barthes published Mythologies, a groundbreaking series of essays in which he analyzed the popular culture of his day, from laundry detergent to the face of Greta Garbo, professional wrestling to the Citroen DS. This series of short books, Object Lessons, continues the tradition. Very interesting. Sometimes I muse around the house and wonder, like, who invented the glass bottle? How was glass invented? Stuff like that. But I don't walk around the house thinking of the symbolism of these things. I think more of the symbolism of actions rather than things. So I'm very excited to read this book. I'm not going to look at The Praise for Hotel because I think that's another book that is in the series that is not written by this author. So let's go here. Object Lessons, a book series about the hidden lives of ordinary things. The series editor is Ian Bogost and Christopher Schauberg. The advisory board are these people that you'll see on the screen. I won't be reading all their names. Here are some other books in the series. We have Remote Control, Golf Ball, Driver's License, Drone, Silence, Glass, Phone Booth, Refrigerator, Waste, Hotel, Hood, Dust, Shipping Container, Cigarette Lighter, Bookshelf, Tree, Bread, Hair, Password, Eye Chart, Questionnaire, Shopping Mall, Blanket, Doorknob, Sock. Nobody did Toilet yet? Toilet is not on the list. I feel like that would be worth quite a lot of analysis. Anyway, this book was first published in 2016, once again, by the Bloomberg Academic Press, Bloomsbury Publishing, Inc. Okay? So let's go here. First page. On March 28th, 2012, U.S. Representative Bobby L. Rush spoke on the floor of the House, removing his jacket and pulling up the hood of his gray sweatshirt. He said, Racial profiling has to stop, Mr. Speaker. Just because someone wears a hoodie does not make them a hoodlum. Just because someone is a young black male and wears a hoodie does not make them a hoodlum. I applaud the young people across this nation who are making a statement about hoodies and the real hoodlums, particularly those who tread on our laws wearing official or quasi official cloaks. Representative Greg Harper said members need to remove their hoods or leave the floor. The sergeant at arms escorted Representative Rush from the chamber. That's a crazy story. I didn't know that story actually happened. Yeah, a part of me wanted to put in the thumbnail of this video the picture, the infamous picture of Trayvon Martin with his head pulled up that he took like on his computer camera or something like that. I didn't do that because I wanted us to continue to focus on the real hooded villains in our society, which are the white supremacists, which is why I chose an image of the KKK member in the thumbnail. But I am looking forward to reading the part here where they will talk about Trayvon's story because, you know, there were so many people in the media like Geraldo Rivera, right, who are saying things like, you know, Trayvon dressed like a hoodlum, like a criminal because he was wearing a hood, right? And we know that's incredibly racist, incredibly horrible to say about that child. He deserved to die, or his death is somehow justified because he looked like a criminal. Anyway, here are the contents. That very, very simple thing about the hood, the Grim Reaper, the executioner, and the executed, the struggle against terrorism will be on page 29. Two murals, the Ku Klux Klan lynching, the Spanish Inquisition, a timeline of hooding Abu Ghraib. Little Red Riding Hoodlum will be on page 69. Our Bodies, Our Hoods, the Seattle WTO protests, black blocks and pink blocks, and it's what's under the hood that counts. Everybody's hoods, anti-hoodie initiatives, and Black Lives Matter. Then we have the acknowledgments on page 117, list of illustrations 119, the notes on 121, and the index on 149. So it should be a short book. We should be able to finish this over the next 4 days, right? Because once again, we'll probably just do one chapter a day and break it down. So let's start here. That very, very simple thing about the hood. I've long believed that the content of fashion does not materialize spontaneously, but in ways both mysterious and uncanny, emerges from the fabric of the times. That fabric has recently been darkly threaded by war and uncertainty, said Anna Wintour, editor in chief of American Vogue. That's an interesting way of putting it. I think what Anna is trying to say here, like, fashion just doesn't create itself in a vacuum. People don't just wear suits and ties out of nowhere. The hooded sweater wasn't just invented out of nowhere. She is saying like the way we've been living in the 20th century going into the 21st century, a lot of it was influenced by war. We had some of the most horrible wars in human history, right? So when we think about the hood, it's sort of like protection, to hide identity, to keep us warm and safe because we don't have shelter, that sort of thing. That's how you can interpret it. That's my interpretation of Anna Wintour's statement here. Continuing here, we all wear hoods: judges, athletes, rappers, torturers, politicians, and toddlers. We don hoods to attend school, commute to the construction site or office, go to war or protest, take a hike, walk the dog, ride the Maid of the Mist, or visit our grannies in the woods. We dress babies in animal-eared hooded onesies to enhance their resemblance to other species. And if we're Anne Geddes, to conquer the world. We zip kids into hooded snowsuits to induce them infallibly to pee. Okay. Okay, I'm not looking forward to having kids if that's what it takes to get them to pee. You better pee. I'm not playing around with you. Ain't no onesies or nothing getting stained. You better pee in the toilet, pee in the sink. Anyway, coaches, firefighters, fishers, boxers, beekeepers, and Mark Zuckerberg wear hoods professionally. Skaters, cosplayers, fetishists, presidents, and the entire Knowles Carter family wear them to play. It's very simple. Everybody with style, everybody venturing out into the rain, everybody not completely resistant to one of the world's most practical, ubiquitous garments of the past couple millennia wears hoods. The hoods in this book come in wool, polyester, leather, cotton, pasteboard, hide, palm leaves, and plastic. Their designs range from garments we'd all agree were hoods to objects that stretch the definition, objects we wouldn't call hoods in other contexts. Anne Boleyn's round headdress was a French hood. The Queen of Hearts' pointed headdress was an English hood. Professors in formal academic dress sling gabardine and silk hoods around their necks. At Abu Ghraib, plastic sandbags and women's panties served as hoods. Languages, cultures, practices, several continents, and thousands of years of style mean that, for the purposes of this book, if people are wearing them and can agree that they're hoods. Sorry, but you'll have to wait for the sequel to get car hoods, stove hoods, and mount hood. Okay, she's trying to be funny here. Ha 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 ha. Okay. I was I Now that I'm thinking about it, I was thinking about wearing a hood because I do have a hooded sweater in my closet, but it's too hot. It's August. I think outside it's 27 degrees, right? High humidity here in Budapest. It's too hot to wear a hood. I'm trying to stay with the themes of the book, but I can't do everything, especially when I'm trying to read it in the hot summer. Continuing here. We all wear hoods. In the second century, there lived a man named Docilenius, who loved his hood until he suffered a changing room mishap at the spas in Roman Bath. He lodged a complaint inscribed in a lead tablet for management and for all posterity. I curse him who has stolen my hooded cloak, whether man or woman, whether slave or free, and that that the goddess Solus may afflict him with maximum death and not allow him to sleep or children now in the future until he has brought my hooded cloak to the temple of her divinity. Okay, man, all right, chill, chill. It would have been funnier, in 2024, people would have just spray painted "F you" to the guy that stole my hood. Back then in ancient Greece, they were writing long poetic soliloquies about how they hoped the gods strike them down for stealing their clothes. Continuing here. Romano British mosaics and medieval European pictures of the chilly seasons span thousands of years of people wearing hoods to hunt birds or tend their hogs. Throughout the Middle Ages, farmers, physicians, nobles, scholars, clerks, apprentices, pilgrims, and jesters wore cozy hoods for work, play, warmth, and fashion. Kings also wore gloves on cold days and hats or hoods in rainy weather, but we are rarely treated to pictures of them doing so. Even their falcons wore tiny leather hoods with knots and bells, after Crusaders adopted the practices of Arab falconers. Hoods were such commonplace articles of dress that John Mandeville's 14th century ethnography of the Tartars in Cathay marvels, "Hoods use they none." Okay. European Christian monks adopted the hooded habit from their 5th century Coptic predecessors in Egypt. Not only monks, but also a variety of other clerics wore cowls made of serge, woolen twill. Through the medieval Franciscans fretted, though the medieval Franciscans fretted about the difficulty of finding color fast, cheap black dyes for their hoods. Hoods served them for religious business, for protection from the rain or sun, and at least in the Canterbury Tales, for carrying knives and pins to give to pretty ladies. Although black hooded monks cast a gloomy shadow over medieval death scenes, their presence still implied the bliss of eternal life, or the bliss of wealth and authority. If you were so lucky to be the Duc de Berry or de Bourgogne, you'd have a gazillion gorgeous little alabaster pleurants, statues of mourners with hoods cast over their faces, carved to decorate your tomb and celebrate your afterlife. For all this, the comfortable everyday hood was no more narrowly a symbol of mourning than a hooded raincoat is now. Who didn't wear a hood? Death, the Grim Reaper, Charon, Father Time. For once upon a time in European art history, death went naked, or whatever the word is. When you're a skeleton with no flesh to cover up, or a transy, an image of a rotting cadaver, letting it all hang out. Okay. Hoods used he none. Okay, she's kind of funny. Allison's kind of funny, low key. I'm starting to like this book. She got jokes in here. In paintings and sculptures, death sometimes accessorized with a jaunty crown, a head wrap, a lady's black headdress, or a clutch of worms wriggling through his eye sockets, or a thatch of hair, like a toupee, complete with sideburns. Though death gave us previews of coming attractions, drawing a shroud coyly up over his skull, he had yet to unleash his signature look, the Black Hood. Long before Desmond Davis's movie Clash of the Titans, 1981, depicted Charon as a black-hooded skeleton, the ancient Greeks, who presumably knew best, had seen Charon only as a ferryman holding out his hand for the fair, sometimes wearing a cone-shaped pillows hat. For both Virgil and Dante, Charon was an old man with fiery eyes, an image persisting as late as Auguste Fayenne Perrin's The Boat of Charon. Although Michelangelo, who moved in mysterious ways, painted Charon as a mustached, muscular Yoda. Two other mythical figures of death also went hoodless. Winged Thanatos appears in ancient Greek art and drama, sometimes as a baby, sometime a man in a hat or a black robe. The Anku, the death worker of Breton legend, is just a skeleton or a shaggy old man in a hat or shroud. One popular internet photo of a hooded Anku carved in stone dates only to a playful 1995 church restoration. Even the Grim Reaper in Father Time once went hoodless, as did the skeletons of the medieval Danzes Macabres. In these murals and engravings depicting processional dances of the quick and the dead, it's not the dead, but the living dancers who wear hoods. Also, cloaks, hats, shoes, and other weather appropriate gear, presumably because it's the living who mind the cold. As Death tells the abbess in John Lydgate's 1426 Dance of the Dead, and you, my lady, gentle Dame Abbess, with your furred mantles large and wide, your veil, your wimple of exceedingly great richness, and soft beds, you must now leave aside, for to this dance I shall be your guide. Beautiful poetry right here. I have to say this. Something I think about, and I can say this because this is the Book React series, because everybody tunes out after the first 3 minutes where I just go off on people. I just have to say this. One of the coolest things about ancient Greece are their names, like Sharon. Like, that's a cool name. Other than knowing that that is the name of the god of death, or the man that leads people to Hades on a boat. I would think that would be a pretty cool name to have as a person, or to give to your son or daughter, or something like that. But one of the conflicts that I have in my mind all the time is, like, whatever I do name my child, I don't want it to be a continuation of the naming of that comes from the lineage of the white supremacists, right? And the thing I think about often is that, like, many of the slaves back in the day that come from my lineage in America, they had names of ancient Greek philosophers, right? Because the white slave masters thought it was funny to name their slaves that couldn't read, couldn't write, were kept ignorant and in the dark. They thought it was funny to name their black slaves like Socrates or Plato or Aristotle or something like that, right? Now I know whatever child I have will be hella educated, hella smart, and have so many opportunities, because I'm gonna make sure I try to instill in them the love of the written word and the love for knowledge. But I don't want to name them after people, if they went back thousands of years, that would look down on them, right? Or continue on giving them names that don't relate to their blackness or their identity, right? Because I want to try to break the mold of us as black people constantly, you know, ascribing closer to whiteness in in uh, uh, in parts of our identity, if that makes sense. It's something I go back and forth with my mind. But yeah, the Greeks have really cool names. Thanatos, like, that's a cool name. Charon, Thanatos, that would be hella cool names. But I don't know if I can bring myself to name them that. And plus, I'm pretty sure my wife would hella disagree. Hella disagree. Anyway, but maybe Death got cold too, dancing skimpily over the course of the Little Ice Age, 1300 to 1870. In the 16th century, he donned some suspiciously hood-like headgear for Hans Holbein the Younger's Danse Macabre prints, published in 1538 and reissued in hundreds of both authorized and pirated editions. Pieter Bruegel, the Elder's painting Triumph of Death, 1562, captured a moment of symbolic invention and transition. With its black hooded skeletons, bare-headed Grim Reaper, and awesomely a blue jester hooded skeleton crashing a party like it's 1599. She got jokes. This girl got jokes. Okay, I'm gonna like this book because she got a little jokes in here. Okay. I see you, Allison. Anyway, and in a castle in northeast England, even a Jacobean poltergeist who complained, "I'm called," was banished by the gift of a warm hood. Here's a cloak, here's a hood. The Claude Lod O. Hilton will do no more good. Okay. After Holbein and Bruegel, Hooded Death finally went viral. In Francisco de Goya's spooky Ken Vien El Coco, my Spanish is horrible, y'all don't roast me, written in 1797 and published in 1799 maybe, Gustavo Dore's Death depicted as the Grim Reaper on top of the moon, 1845, Dickens' Ghost of Christmas, yet to come, the French crime fiction villain Fantomas, Disney's Wiki Queen of the Maleficent, the Nazgul, Emperor Palpatine, Skeletor, South Park's Kenning, J.K. Rowling's Death Eaters, Benedict Cumberbatch's Khan, and the Unabomber's Wanted poster. Hooded bereavement spans the permutations of Victorian widows' weeds, Buddhist white sackcloth hoods, and Mexico's Santa Muerte, and the Gug Lamaner, Bavarian separatists who are still mourning the 1886 death of Ludwig II. Charmingly, a study of Swedish healthcare professionals found that 84% of men and 65% of women image or imagine death as an old man, usually dressed in dark clothing. Described most often as a dark cloak or mantle with a hood. The hood is thought to conceal a thin, bony face, which among 15% of the study group was said to be that of a skull. Nearly one quarter of the respondents referenced Ingmar Bergman's film The Seventh Seal. The study doesn't cite Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. Okay, Allison, I see you. You got to chill with the jokes. You got to chill with the jokes. And in the medieval painting of Death playing chess in Tabi, said to inspire Bergman, Death isn't wearing a hood. Basically, what she's describing here is that people associate a lot of the evil characters in fiction with wearing hoods because that's how they're depicted or written about. And yeah, in people's minds, when she polled people in Sweden, basically, they said, when death comes, it's going to be a hooded man with a bony face coming to take you away, right? Um, is that how I imagine death? No, I mean, when I think about how I'm going to die, right, or I imagine my last moments, I just imagine, just slowly fading away to black, and the woman on top of me basically saying, get up." My wife saying, "Get up, I'm about to come." That's how I imagine death. I imagine death as my beautiful curly haired wife riding me on top, and her last words are, "I'm gonna come," and I'm gonna say, "I'm gonna go." Anyway, but Hooded Death isn't just fun and games of chess. In 1987, a television ad from the Australian National Advisory Committee on AIDS depicted the Grim Reaper at a bowling alley, knocking down people with like pins. The Grim Reaper was meant to represent HIV, or perhaps to demonize gay men and drug users. The history of the Hood is a danse macabre, where the hooded living and dead join hands. We all wear hoods, but our hoods evoke everything from recess and the wind chill factor to executioners and cross burning. They evoke poetry, legislation, and playful or fatal speculations on what exactly hooding means. More often than not, this ambiguity protects the powerful at the expense of the heads of killers, victims, or both at once, confusing motives and the innocent lack of any motive at all, to disastrous and deadly ends, even for nations at war. We sanctify the executioner with impersonality. We say he is the hand of the state and must be protected. He is retaliating for us decent people against a man who has left society, a man who has repudiated citizenship by committing the act of murder. Bull fucking shit. The executioner is not a figure of vengeance, and his hood is not disguising his identity because everyone knows who's behind it. The hood is his sanctification, and what it sanctifies is denial. Very deep. Very, very deep right here. Anyway, Douglas Dennis said this, late editor of the Louisiana State Penitentiary Inmates magazine, the Angolite. I got to look at the Angolite. I didn't even know that Angola had a magazine. I learn something new every day. You know what they say? The best way to hide information from a N word is what? In a book. I got to look at the Angolite. That seems hella cool. Hella cool. So, anyway, continuing here. Nobody plays the role of Grim Reaper quite like Florida in the 21st century. In the 1970s, after a brief national moratorium on capital punishment, many of the states that resumed the death penalty developed elaborate penal secrecy procedures. Florida outdid them all. The state commissioned a medieval hood to completely conceal its executioners' identities. Ivan Solotaroff has recorded how, at dawn, a corrections staffer drives to an agreed upon location to pick up the executioner already wearing his hood and escorts him through the prison to the executioner's cubby. It is a strange sight indeed, that man sitting there in his hood amidst the Florida DOC's unusually jocular spokesman, Eugene Morris, whom I speak to several times in an attempt to interview the executioner, particularly in this day and age, not to mention at 6 in the morning. Does he look like something out of the past in his hood? Yes, I would say very much. I can't believe that. That's got to be crazy. Hold on, wait. Florida executioner hood. I got to see this. Hold on, wait. Hold on, wait. No, no, no. I can't find any images. Florida. I can't find any images on Google for that. Florida executioner in prison wearing hood. I wonder if there are any pictures. Nope. Okay, no, I can't find anything showing that. But I'll believe it. I'll believe it. I can believe Florida would do that. I can't imagine that Florida would have any problems with that. If you can find images of that, let me know. Put it in the chat. Continuing here. Continuing here, Florida pays its executioners in cash, keeping their names off the accounting rolls, and the death team may not publicly acknowledge their participation in executions. Well, we were sworn to secrecy when I first got on the team. I wouldn't even tell my wife what I was doing. The deal was keep it among ourselves. Whatever we say or do down here has got to stay down here, you know? Even Florida doctors have worn purple moon suits with face shields to hide their identities from the American Medical Association, which bans medical attendance on executions. We are a profession dedicated to healing, says the AMA. Participation in an execution is an image of a physician with a dark hood. In 2014, Florida Representative Michelle Rehwinkle Vaslinda sponsored legislation requiring the disclosure of executioners' identities, but it died in the Criminal Justice Subcommittee. Yeah, I mean, of course, I know my right wing audience would disagree, but the death penalty in America should be abolished, should be banned. You know, there have been so many people who have been on death row that have been found innocent. Innocent, like literally every single year, there's at least three or four, five stories at least of mostly black men who were on death row, and then DNA evidence or the witness recounts their statements, takes back their statements and stuff like that, and then yeah, this person is let free. You get what I'm saying? So if the state even has the possibility to kill one person unjustly, it shouldn't have the right to do it at all. Nobody would say, hey, you know, everybody outside, every day outside, the government should just shoot a random person who might be a criminal, right? Shoot random people that might be criminals. We know that there is a high probability they would shoot people who would most likely be innocent. It's the same thing with the death penalty as well. There is a high probability that the U.S. government, federally and also statewide, have executed people who were innocent. So there doesn't need to be a death penalty. Some people will say some crimes are so heinous that people will never be able to rehabilitate themselves and be reintroduced into society. You could say that. I believe there's an argument against also life imprisonment as well, but I would say this at least. The death penalty should be off the table. And I'm very interested to hear that the AMA, the American Medical Association, bans doctors from not participating in executions. And I think any doctor that's caught going against the AMA shouldn't be allowed to have their license. Right? It's crazy that the AMA, the board that licensed doctors, says that you cannot do this as a doctor, and doctors do it anyway. Right? Continuing here. Although Florida's rituals are extreme by comparison with those of states such as Alabama, where executioners' identities are matters of public record, many states hood their death teams, either literally or figuratively. In South Carolina, executioners would go into the death house dressed in ponchos, covering their heads prior to everybody else's getting there to protect their identity. In Oklahoma, they wear ghost like hoods and robes. In 1990, a Washington state court ruled that prison authorities need not disclose the names or qualifications of its new hangman, who refused to do the job if his identity were revealed. Said the judge, the undisputed evidence is that the state could not proceed with an execution if disclosure were made. Although many executioners don't wear hoods, hooding remains an apt metaphor for many other mechanisms of penal secrecy. Technologies that obscure which bullet or switch delivers death, the screening of witnesses, death chamber curtains, recording bans, non disclosure of executioners' professional competence, and drug and equipment suppliers. All these procedures hood the violence, horror, and guilt of executions, even from the people conducting them, thus allowing them to continue. Critics often invoke the so-called Dark Ages to explain the tradition behind Florida's medieval mask and hood. They write, the hooded executioner anonymously dispatching enemies of the crown may be the stuff of costume dramas, but in Florida, the secrecy is reality. For centuries of tradition, they say executioners have ritually worn black hoods to to insulate them from the weight of the responsibility of taking a human life, to prevent their recognition, to protect their identities, which would offer them a token shield against harm. The evasive theatrics of U.S. capital punishment have struck reformers as quote unquote medieval, at least since founding father and death penalty opponent Benjamin Rush wrote in 1788. My essay upon the punishment of murder by death has been attacked in our newspapers by the Reverend Mr. Anand. His arguments are flimsy and such as would apply better to the 15th than the 18th century. Yes, because they were so enlightened in the 18th century. Water break. All right. But European execution art tells a different story, a surprising story with surprising consequences for contemporary debates on capital punishment. Like the Grim Reaper, the executioner once went hoodless. In paintings and sculptures of decapitations, burnings, and hangings, executioners have worn kerchiefs, helmets, and all kinds of hats. A top hat in Theodore Gericault's public hanging in London, circa 1820. Or, in the glorious humanist tradition, nothing at all. Raphael, The Massacre of the Innocents, circa 1509. But until quite recently, no hoods, no masks, no anonymizing headgear. Their faces are fully visible, and in many pictures, the executioner is distinguishable from the spectators only by the axe or noose he holds. Some documented executioners have worn distinctive costumes. In 16th century Nuremberg, executioner and diarist Franz Schmidt tarted up in a ruffled collar, a nice jerkin and doublet, and bright colored hose. Mastro Titta, the Papal States executioner from 1796 to 1865, wore a red cloak and a matching red puffy hat to work, but took off the cloak before mounting the scaffold. Again, no hoods. What then of the stigma and anonymity? Says Schmidt's biographer, the whole idea of a mask, it's a joke to think that you were going to you were going to remain anonymous, that people in a town weren't going to know who you were. Paradoxically, even the stigma suggests that communities were fully aware of their executioners' identities. In the early modern Dutch Republic, Flanders, and Germany, people often stoned executioners in the street or solicited them for medical advice, since they had intimate knowledge of how bodies were put together. By the 18th century, almost all the Dutch hangman's families were related to each other. Endogamy would have been neither necessary nor practical if their communities hadn't known who they were. And in Paris, everybody knew that the Sanson family held the office of executioner for nearly 2 centuries. Very interesting. Very interesting. This is wild history. The exceptions to executioner recognition prove the rule. Peter Hubrick's print of the executioner of England's Charles I shows the executioner and his assistant wearing white owlish masks, the kind you'd be sure to wear too if you were committing a highly visible and controversial public regicide. In paintings of martyrdoms, especially medieval crucifixions, executioners do sometimes wear distinctive white coifs, baby bonnet like hoods, everyday colored hoods, turbans, and pointy hats. These hoods and hats, though, have been identified by Ruth Mellenkopf as belonging to the Christian iconographic tradition of Jews' hats. Christians depicted Jewish figures as wearing Jews' hats in order to demarcate and denigrate them. Widespread recognition of the symbol eventually inspired some communities to force their Jewish members to wear actual Jews' hats and hoods. Thus, the medieval artistic tradition of hooding martyrs, executioners, represents not real penal practice, but the anti Semitic attempt to make executioners look like stereotypically Jewish Christ killers. Interesting. Interesting. If this weren't obvious enough, later painters would add hooded noses and dark skin colors under the hoods. This use of the hood should give us pause. It's a representative strategy that recurs throughout the hood's history. Authorities and media makers associate the garment with a vulnerable community, then brand that garment as a vehicle for death. Every time hooded death makes an appearance, we need to ask whom the depiction benefits and how. One contemporary example is the sinister Red Riding Hood murderer of Daphne du Maurier's Don't Look Now, made into a 1973 film by Nicolas Roche. The story personifies Hooded Death as a person with disabilities. Amidst the jumble of documentation, fantasy, and bigotry, who benefited from creating the symbol of the hooded executioner? Whose lives were at stake. The quote unquote historic hooding of today's executioners is a political sleight of hand with real mortal consequences. Many scholars have chronicled how, starting in the 17th century around the world, philosophers, humanitarians, and revolutionaries campaigned to reform or abolish capital punishment. Caesar Beccaria's An Essay on Crimes and Punishment, 1764, inspired abolition in Tuscany and Thomas Jefferson's work on the Virginia Penal Code. See, that's irony right there, right? Abolition, I guess, of slavery in Tuscany, and Thomas Jefferson, a notorious slaveholder in the Americas. A little bit of irony right there. I caught that, if that's what she's trying to imply. Anyway, reformers argued against cruel and excessive punishment. They advocated privacy, dignity, human rights, professionalization, medicalization, and above all, the removal of executions from public view, if not their outright abolition. Unfortunately, reformers and authorities collaborated in the invention of such humane alternatives to capital punishment as penitentiaries, hard labor, and solitary confinement. 19th century elite reformers often cared less about the rights of condemned people than about sparing their own delicate sensibilities or repressing what Baldwin professor Thomas Uffam called the great riots, noise, confusion, drunkenness, and every species of crime of public execution audiences. Anti-populists fretted that the crowd's brutality would lead to copycat crimes, bloodlust, and commercial disruptions. So basically, they wanted to ban, criminal punishment. They wanted to ban the death penalty, not because, they thought it was morally wrong, right? It was because they didn't like a bunch of drunk people seeing a lynching or an execution and then committing more crimes, right? Anyway, as a result, reform perpetuated what in 1841 the Democratic Review called a private judicial assassination, which shrinks from the open view of the public and perpetuates its revolting function only within the guarded precincts of the prison walls in the presence of a small number of officials or privileged spectators. Executions move from the public scaffold to the prison and from local jurisdictions to states under the auspices of centralized, professionalized bureaucracy. Throughout the next century, the tightening of procedural, technological, and even interior decorating constraints cut off public access and oversight. The reformers had unwittingly helped create the wrong remedy, as Sing Sing warden Thomas Mott Osborne said. They abolished publicity instead of abolishing executions. Enter George Cruikshank, caricaturist and illustrator of the works of Charles Dickens, whom he later accused of ripping off his original plot for Oliver Twist. Cruikshank's 1840 illustration of the 15th execution of Lady Jane Grey portrayed a bizarrely fiendish, bat-like executioner in a black mask. Cruikshank also depicted the 1606 execution of Guy Fawkes, with the axeman in a black mask under a black capitaine hat, and the hangman in a low-drawn black cavalier hat with a black cape. Cruikshank helped usher in a 19th century fad for painting hooded executioners, retroactively outfitted in fantasy costumes that diverged from any historical reality. Another example is John Paul Laurent's mural of the 1383 execution of the Melottin rebels at Paris's Hotel de Ville. These sinister, hooded executioner images enabled reformers, then and now, to draw self-congratulatory delineations between savage, old-timey executions and supposedly humane, dignified, superior modern capital punishment, as the Cincinnati Enquirer did in 1897. When it crowd that to when it crowd that the introduction of the electric chair made hanging a relic of barbarism in Ohio. This identification of the Middle Ages with barbarism is what Umberto Eco calls shaggy medievalism, and it's not just medieval scholars who should get mad about it. As Robert Mills writes, Foucault may well declare that what he terms the modern carceral city, with its imaginary geopolitics, takes us far away from the country of torturers, dotted with wheels, gibbets, gallows, pillories, but tell that to the people being tortured now in the police cells, prisons, detention centers, and execution chambers of, yes, the modern West. Ah, Beautiful writing here. I really love this book so far. Very good writing. It's so crazy to think that people thought the electric chair was more humane than hanging or the guillotine, right? Because I've heard that in the electric chair, they'd have to flip the switch sometimes a few times for somebody to die. Imagine getting like 30,000 volts of electricity through your body and you're still living, cooked, fried, steaming, and then they have to do it again and do it again until you croak. That's absolutely crazy. Anyway, if you can stomach an online search for images of the medieval executioner, you'll see shaggy medievalism at work. And I don't mean in the bondage gear, which is a realm of play. Okay. Okay, Allison, you freaky nasty girl. One of our top hits, cribbed from the 1859 volume Costume Anciens et Moderne, depicts a man wearing a black robe and a full face black hood with eye holes. But this illustration is not of an executioner. The original volume correctly identifies him as a comforter, a member of one of many Catholic lay brotherhoods originating in 14th century Italian cities. Comforters visited, prayed with, and escorted the condemned to their executions. They brandished paintings of martyrs before prisoners' eyes to inspire them, to induce docility, and to conceal the sight of the scaffold. The comfort they offered was ethically dubious. In promising heavenly rewards for submission to earthly authority, the comforters soothed the workings of penal violence. Yet their invocation of martyrdom was unintentionally subversive, suggesting that the condemned prisoners might also be innocent martyrs. In the anonymity of their black hoods, the comforters managed all at once to abet, allay, and question judicial violence. This ethical ambiguity is missing from the stereotype of the savage executioner, but relevant to death teams today, with their emphasis on dignity and decorum. These quibbles about the Comforters' hoods, anti Semitic hoods, and the neo medieval Florida hoods aren't just matters of veracity. They're bound up in death penalty rhetoric and politics. The spectacle of the sinister hooded executioner embodying a brutal, distant past diverts our attention from the all too modern violence of the contemporary execution. It obscures past and present complicitly with and resistance to capital punishment. It concentrates all accountability in the single ghoulish figure of the hooded executioner while making us feel better about the supposedly just, impersonal, simple, and humane systems we perpetuate now. That's why we moderns put black hoods on executioners. If Gary wanted to die with dignity, then he had to respect that very simple thing about the hood. It was there for practicality to allow the thing to run very dignified and no movement. Gary listened in silence. Father Mearsman persuades Gary Gilmore to wear the black hood for his 1977 execution by firing squad in Norman Mailer's The Executioner song. Although there's only scanty evidence of the hooding of executioners prior to the late 19th century, there's a long tradition of forcibly hooding prisoners. In 1829, the Quaker style Eastern Penitentiary of Pennsylvania, lauded by Alexis de Tocqueville, required inmates to wear hoods at all times when they were outside their cells for social contributors or witnesses in the eye. Florida also masked prisoners in the electric chair. Masks. They're using the present simple test. So does Florida still use the electric chair? Wow. Made of leather, the mask's surface is blistered by boiling saliva. Oh, oh, wow. One Florida death team leader who role played the part of prisoner for execution rehearsal said it was peculiar, because when they put the mask on me, you can't really tell what the person is doing. You feel helpless, his teammate added. You feel totally helpless. You can't move, you can't see, you can't speak. It's total darkness. All you can hear are sounds around you. It's definitely weird. It's kind of like putting you in another world. You get a little queasy, I guess, from being helpless. You can't fight it. In 1772, French murderer Francois Billiard behaved with such propriety on the trip to the scaffold that he was allowed a hat drawn low over his face to shield him from the crowd's gaze. Everybody, including Billiard, regarded the hat as a reward, or even more insidious, an even more insidious form of social control. Besides ensuring prisoner compliance, hoods and masks dehumanize and objectify prisoners in the eyes of witnesses and executioners. Florida's leather prisoners, mask suggested to one executioner the appearance of a hooded hawk, not a person, but a constrained creature, poised in this instance for death. Louisiana's executioner from 1983 to 1991 said of killing mass prisoners, there's nothing to it. It's no different to me executing somebody and going to the refrigerator and getting a beer out of it. They all look the same. It's just a procedure, and they just happen to be part of it. That's crazy. That's absolutely crazy. I can maybe understand somebody adjusting to that being their job, like executing people. But that's such like a Louisiana answer. It's just a job, buddy. Just a job. Like yeah, I could definitely see big fat Louisiana executioner prison guard saying, "Yep, after we execute the prisoners, I just go grab a beer." I mean, that's crazy to say. Anyway, after the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, a U.S. military commission tried 392 Dakota men and boys in 7 weeks and sentenced 303 to death, although President Lincoln reduced the number to 39. In Mankato, Minnesota, the Army arrayed the prisoners in rows of custom built scaffold with identical white muslin hoods muffling their faces. The victims, who had no lawyers and were prohibited from speaking in their defense during the trials, which were in English anyway, sang through their hoods. They were all hanged at once before 4,000 witnesses. It was the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Afterward, the Sioux War Panorama, a backlit, hand cranked moving picture with live narration and music, took images of the execution on a Midwestern tour, including a stop at the St. Paul Opera House. Insane. Insane. That's crazy to think. Um, yeah, so they made a movie. They literally, the white supremacists are evil. Like what they did to the Native Americans is straight up evil right here. They executed 39 Indian boys when they had no lawyers. You know what I mean? For a crime. What exactly was the crime? Yeah, okay, the war. America was going to war with the Native Americans because we were stealing their land. And then some Dakota men got, sentenced to death as prisoners of war, I guess. 39 of them were killed. They didn't know what was happening at their trial because it was in English. And yeah, they all got killed in front of 4,000, mostly white people looking. And then they made a movie about it and took it on tour. That's sick, man. Anyway, hooding prisoners for execution is one of the procedures that create the reassurance of higher civilization. As a New York doctor attending the first judicial electrocution marveled in 1890. A party of ladies could sit in a room where an execution of this kind was going on and not see anything repulsive whatsoever. Or, as the Florida Department of Corrections now manually certifies to the governor, the procedure has been reviewed and is compatible with evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society, the concepts of the dignity of man, and advances in science, research, pharmacology, and technology. The foremost objective of the lethal injection procedure is a humane and dignified death. Or, as the California Governor Ronald Reagan put it in 1973, being a former farmer and horse raiser, I know what it's like to try to eliminate an injured horse by shooting him. Now you call the veterinarian and the vet gives it a shot and the horse goes to sleep. That's it. In 1848, the American Whig Review advocated chloroforming the condemned because their convulsions disturbed the witnesses. Wow. Witnesses nervous peace, which is the support of refinement. Such a disturbing execution was against good manners and unbecoming in a civilized Christian people. Such concern for witness sensibility suggested that the witnesses, even the executioner himself, were the most vulnerable people at an execution, while the prisoner was a kind of grim reaper, even at the moment of his own death. Former Virginia executioner turned abolitionist Jerry Givens once said he found electrocution more humane than injection, for the executioner who thereby felt less attached. When authorities tried to avert botched executions, such as those in 2014 in Ohio, Oklahoma, and Arizona, it's hard to tell who they're concerned for. Note the pervasiveness and implications of calling an execution that fails to kill botched. During the 1988 Allison, stop, stop. You're killing me. You're killing me. That's funny. A botched execution. Botched for who? You tried to kill me. That's funny. That's funny. Uh, okay, anyway. During the 1988 execution, in which Raymond Landry's arm broke loose and spewed fluids around the chamber, the curtains before the viewing room snapped shut, lest the witnesses be traumatized. Wow. Okay. Uh, wow. Okay. Anyway, as Sister Helen Prejean wrote, the worst possible injury to execution participants and witnesses is the harm to good conscience. The hooding, pacifying, and sequestering of prisoners conceal not only their pain and suffering, but also the reminder of complicity. With witnesses behind the square of plexiglass like that, it was like a framed scene. Death in the movies, death in celluloid, death under glass. There he was, saying his last words. There he was, walking to the chair. There he was, being strapped in. Three clangs of the switch. No smell of burning flesh. The plexiglass shields witnesses from the smell. No sight of his face. The mask conceals his face, his eyes, and with his jaw strapped shut like that, he could not cry out. Who killed this man? Nobody. Mm. What would happen if the plexiglass and the hoods were removed? Who, besides the condemned, might cry out? After Cincinnati's first private execution in 1852, the Reverend George Washington Quimby called the crowds who'd gathered outside a ragged, drunken, profane, cutthroat appearing crew of all nations and colors, men, women, and children, peering through the crevices in the wall, smoking, chewing, drinking, and cracking jokes o'er each other's heads. The view of the execution mob, which still pervades death penalty rhetoric, was largely invented by reformers. Before then, authorities depended on public spectators to legitimize, witness, and even assist with executions. Likewise, the stampede for lottery tickets to Timothy McVeigh's execution and the costumed, pot banging, effigy bearing crowds at Ted Bundy's simultaneously embarrassed authorities and validated the sentences. What reform really sought to eliminate was the chance of audience getting too close, seeing through the hoods, and veering off script. Before the reforms, public executions sometimes afforded opportunities for crowds and the condemned to re-adjudicate sentences and denounce injustice. In 1761, Parisians rioted to prevent the hanging of a servant who had committed petty theft, begged forgiveness, and returned the stolen cloth. After the crowds had halted her execution, they looted her accuser's shop, then obtained the prisoner's pardon. Audiences from Edinburgh to Prague also assaulted executioners, rescued prisoners from scaffolds, and in France bought them new suits. They once stole the entire scaffold and gallows in Montreal. Even the most orthodox institutional witnesses sometimes choose to identify with the condemned. In 1674 in Massachusetts, at Benjamin Goad's hanging for fornication with a female horse. White people and bestiality. Samuel Danford spent half his scaffold sermon denouncing Goad before turning on the crowd. If we ransack our own hearts, we shall find such sins with us. The holiest man hath a vile and filthy a nature as the Sodomites. Let no man insult over him, nor yet flatter himself in his sins, but let us all learn to fear and tremble before the Lord. Danforth's intent was to damn everybody, not to excuse Goad. Still, he was a Puritan preacher willing to drop all pretensions of superiority to a horsefucker. I'm sorry, I did that caught me off guard. By comparison, how does Associate Justice Antonin Scalia live with himself after claiming that lethal injection was an enviable death for Henry Lee McCollum, an innocent man who spent 30 years on death row before his 2014 exoneration? Mm. Once again, we shouldn't kill anybody because there are so many innocent people on death row. How many is so many? One. One. Nobody deserves to die because they're falsely accused and convicted of a crime, right? And there's too high of a probability for that happening in America, especially for black men. In 17th century London, Margaret Clark was sentenced to death for arson, but just after the execution had but just after the executioner had pulled the hood over her face, she yanked it back up herself to address the crowd. Gentlemen, I have one thing more to say, she declared, then denounced her accomplice who'd been acquitted. I testify before you all, now I am going to eternity, that he is the very man responsible for the fire. Her speech was later published as a popular broadside that connected her personal story to the larger question of miscarried justice. It happened because been able to doff the hood and engage with the public. Nowhere was the importance of audience access, for good or bad, more apparent than in the great exception to the U.S. sequester of capital punishment, the Southern states continuing well into the 20th century to publicly execute black prisoners. From 1866 to 1920, 76% of judicially executed Southerners were black. Wow. Wow. From 1866 to 1920, 76% of judicially executed Southerners were black, twice their proportion of the population. As in the case of the massacred Dakota men, the authorities had no scruples that witnessing the executions might hurt the audience's sensibility, or even any coherent notion of crowd deterrence or incitement. All were irrelevant to the whole scale criminalization of black people and the consolidation of white power. What authorities didn't reckon on was black communities' transformation of legal murder into opportunities for martyrdom. With hymns, prayers, and the accused's last speech announcing salvation, one as rendered by the Birmingham Age Herald in 1894, I is happy to know that I's to die like Jesus Christ to save sinners as example, and when I's gone, the folks will say, he's gone to rest. He give his life as example. That's okay. That's wow. 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 I just need to take a moment there. Anyway, prisoners and spectators mounted a pious, devastating protest of racial injustice. In 1891, the New Orleans Picayune opined that the ideal execution of a black person precluded his stating that he would go straight to heaven and no everlasting glory. There was none of the glory hallelujah sensational accompaniment. While some historians suggest that the South finally implemented private executions because the public ones too closely resembled lynchings, Michael A. Trotty argues that the public ones with the black witnesses' sanctification and resistance didn't look enough like lynchings to satisfy whites. Indoors, with a private audience, authorities could stage real Jim Crow executions, witnessed only by white men bereft of redemption and intended to strike a more mysterious terror in the heart of the superstitious African, as the Richmond Times Dispatch put it in 1908. To dismiss all these different crowds as rowdy troublemakers of all nations and colors oversimplifies popular expressions of empathy, faith, and protest, perpetuates ugly stereotypes, and persists in the state control of witnesses and protesters. Conquergood, what a crazy name. Dwight Conquergood. That sounds like the fakest name of a celebrity trying to check into a hotel. Is that Lenny Kravitz? No, my name is Dwight Conquergood. Dwight Conquergood described how he and other vigil keepers had to gather in a fenced corridor, submit to searches, ride Bureau of Prisons buses escorted by guards with rifles, and take a pledge of nonviolence. We will not swear or use insulting language. We will not run in public or otherwise make threatening motions. We will honor the directions of the designated coordinators. In the event of serious disagreement, we will remove ourselves from the vigil action. When the Angola warden warned Sister Helen Prejean against creating a circus atmosphere, what kind of stunts did he suppose she might try? And how could her tricks, or those of protesters, be any worse than the violence enacted in the chamber? If the very, very simple thing about the hood and about all the figurative hoods of penal secrecy is that the practicality for allowing things to run very dignified, there's a very, very complicated reality it's trying to conceal. Like the execution of Alan Lee Tiny Davis in 1999, a surprise gush of blood from under his black hood belied the facade of cleanliness and dignity, making witnesses and staff gasp in horror. Disturbing post-mortem photos of Davis, with the hood half yanked off his face, hit the internet, sparked outrage, and made the American Civil Liberties Union request an execution moratorium from Governor Jeb Bush until officials can ensure that they can be conducted humanely. My emphasis. Although hoods and other concealment protocols don't always work as intended, they're designed to prevent just this scenario. Otherwise, executions run the risk of reactions like the NYPD inspector William H. Bell when he witnessed an 1851 hanging. It was the most sickening sight that I ever beheld, and God grant that I may never have an occasion to witness another execution, and that the death penalty may be abolished and imprisonment for life be substituted. Then they hoodwinked my sons to hang them. They came to hoodwink me also. But I told them they need not, for I could look them in the faces and was not afraid to die. William Edmondson. So, founder of Quakerism in Ireland, on his and his sons nearly being executed in 1690. Continuing here. A prisoner need not be blameless for a government to be guilty of killing him and trying to hide it. Former President Saddam Hussein's trial was rife with accusations of human rights violations and judicial irregularities, and his execution shredded the final impression of dignity in the proceedings. While his executioners and witnesses wore black masks, Hussein declined to be hooded. The video images of his unhooded, unrepentant, praying face and of that same face gruesomely contorted troubled the legitimacy not only of the execution but also of democracy itself. I saw that video when it leaked. It still haunts me. So many things about the Iraq War haunts me. Not only my best friend committing suicide after going to Iraq and Afghanistan, but like images of Abu Ghraib, the pictures of like soldiers being burnt alive in tanks shown in the Time magazine and stuff like that. Oh man, hearing about Iraqi weddings getting bombed on. Like there's video of like these two Iraqis getting married and then everything blows up from an American bomb. So many things haunt me about Iraq, like the images we saw in Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib. You know what I mean? So many things. I'm sorry. Uh, so yeah, continuing here. The video images of his unhooded, unrepentant praying face and of that same face gruesomely contorted troubled the legitimacy not only of the execution but also of democracy itself. They unmasked not Hussein's violence, the summary execution by hanging of 148 men and boys, but that of the new government and of the U.S., which, upon the entrance of its troops into Baghdad in 2003, had hooded Hussein's statue with a U.S. flag, knotting a noose around the statue's neck. As Mills argued of medieval execution art, images of hanging do not always perform the cultural work of those who hang. Any act of state murder runs the risk of looking like exactly what it is. Some states are more upfront about this. The Vigo County, Indiana death certificate lists McVeigh's manner of death as homicide. What would happen if every execution, not only the ISIS beheadings, went viral and made martyrs of the black hooded prisoners? What if Hussein's death inspired us to think of the inescapable barbarity of capital punishment and of the intelligible and conventional reasons why it should always be opposed? Principled objection to the death penalty under any circumstances gains momentum when authorities kill the innocent and the unjustly sentenced. As Camus wrote of the execution of the innocent, when Hugo writes that to him the name of the guillotine is Le Circus, he does not mean that all those who are decapitated are Le Circus, but that one Le Circus is enough for the guillotine to be permanently dishonored. That's sort of like what I'm saying, or what I said earlier about why the death penalty should be abolished. But I have to look up what is Le Circus. I'm not that educated. That's why we're trying to learn. Le Circus definition. Hold on, wait. Okay, all right. So who was the circus? Okay, sorry. I found an article here. Joseph Lascurgus, find a grave. Okay, he was basically an innocent person. Joseph Lascurgus, birth 1763, died in 1796, age 32 or 33. He died in Paris, right? Uh, yeah, basically, it sounds like the story of a person who was unjustly killed by the death penalty. Okay, that seems to be what the circus means. Okay, continuing here. Um, all right, so basically what they're trying to say with this quote is like Lycurgus was an innocent guy. They named the guillotine after him, and because one innocent man died, the guillotine should never be used again. Activists had already realized Activists had already realized 150 years ago that authorities not only executed the innocent, but also disproportionately executed poor people and people of color. In 1847, Philadelphia, 1,777 women petitioned the legislature arguing that the poor were put to death, while the more wealthy universally escaped the penalty. During the 1848 trial of Washington Good, one broadside pleaded for his life as a colored man, one whom society most preeminently injures, doomed by cruel prejudice and wicked statutes. In almost every part of the country, the child of an abused race. While the Boston Herald argued that a white man who had money would have escaped the death penalty, their arguments still hold true, as the Death Penalty Information Center's century of research attest, and the bureaucratic hoodings of capital punishment, from witness control and press gags to armed policing of vigils, all first documented in the 19th century, continue to suppress dissent and outrage about this truth. Two hooded figures face each other, and both their hoods serve power. Sorry. Two hooded figures face each other, and both their hoods serve power. Hooding works finally to protect not the executioner, the executed, or the witnesses to the execution, but the institution of legal murder itself. Authorities use hoods to invoke tradition, to displace violence into the uncivilized past, to deflect attention from death rituals invented in our lifetimes, and to muddle the identities of all involved, regardless of who's wearing the hoods. When Florida costumes its executioner in a medieval hood that no self respecting executioner of the Middle Ages would have worn, it employs both the medieval and the distracting hood itself to hoodwink the public about the policies and justifications of state violence. The hooded executioner means so much more than anachronistic fantasy. His hood signifies a willful obfuscation of power, of overt and covert violence and guilt, of the disavowal of responsibility. Such imagining of tradition reaches far beyond the museums and picture books, pervading contemporary penal practice, politics, life, and death. Very interesting chapter right here. So we finished chapter one, basically talking about how, the wearing of hoods is somehow imagined in the past for, figures related to death and evil, like the people that led people to Hades, right? Back in the day, the gods were shown. The god of death, or the god that would lead you to death, was not shown wearing the hood. He was shown as like a skull, or sometimes naked, because he's like a skeleton, right? So why does he need to wear clothes? And as time progressed, people looked upon the past and reimagined it by saying that the modernity that they lived in was more civilized, and they didn't have to wear hoods while doing the executions, but they painted pictures of people in the past having to wear hoods, showing that there was a certain, how can I say this, mysteriousness about this, right? And the executioner, his identity was never sort of hidden, because people always knew who the executioner was, but it was put in as a ceremonial way of like sanctifying the executioner. And also the executed is supposed to wear the hood to sort of like show his complicity in his own death, or her death, right? And also to protect the audience, right, from having to witness somebody go through their last moments in the pain and torture in their face, right? Very interesting stuff in chapter one. I'm looking forward to reading more about this book. We'll pick up on chapter two in our next live stream. And yeah, once again, if you have any books that you want me to read, put them in the comments, send them to me, send them as a suggestion. Trying to read as much as possible. We're trying to hit at least 10 books this year before the end of the year. This is book 3 in our Book to React series. My first ever book request that my wife said I should read. And if you have any that you want me to look at, put the title in the comment section and we will look at it. Once again, shout out Allison Kinney. You can pick up this book on Amazon for the humble price of only $12 in paperback. And yeah, y'all be easy out there. Peace.